Topic of today's video is oxidation and fermentation as it relates to tea. There's unfortunately a lot of confusion about these two terms, and understandably so. So we're going to talk in a bit more detail and get some of that cleared up. Let's start off with fermentation. Fermentation is a complex biochemical pathway that is done by microorganisms such as yeast and bacteria with one goal and one goal only. That is to sustain the life of those microorganisms. So how do they carry out this fermentation? Well, it's done by enzymes. And if you want to get more information on enzymes, take a look at our enzyme video. You can click on the link, and in that video you'll see that the snake enzymes are back. You do a lot of cutting and interesting things in tea molecules. But these are different enzymes though. These are enzymes inside the yeast and bacteria. So they're using these enzymes to cut up molecules that these microorganisms ate from the tea leaves, and they're releasing energy from those molecules. Perfect, that's great, that's all that microorganism cares about. But for humans, what we care about is sometimes there are molecular byproducts that are made, and those are really pleasurable for us to consume. For instance, ripe pu'er tea. That's exactly a great example, a tea example, that shows how fermentation can be used for benefits for humans. Now, this isn't the only thing. Humans, we're a pretty crafty bunch, so we have determined a lot of things throughout the centuries that can be good that are done by fermentation. Take a look at these two. This is kimchi and this is yogurt. Now, both of these are very pleasurable to eat, but they also have a lot of side benefits as well, which is benefits for our health. As you eat kimchi and yogurt, most of the bacteria in there, the probiotics, get killed in your stomach by the acid, but a little bit of them get through in your gut. And then what do they start doing in your gut? They start fermenting and making good health benefit molecules that keep us in top shape. Other things are fermented as well. Yeast inside of bread ferments it to help it rise. Another thing made by yeast is beer. All alcoholic beverage is fermented. Beer, wine, whiskeys, it's all done by fermentation, it's all done by yeasts. Something a little bit surprising is chocolate is actually fermented. It starts off being fermented by yeast. It takes some of the sugars in the chocolate, in the pod, turns it into alcohol, and then bacteria turn that alcohol into acids. And then you get a lot of steps in between to finally get to good quality chocolate. Of course, the most important one for tea lovers is fermented tea. This is a 2004 ripe pu'er tea, Lao Banjiang. It's a great example of fermented teas. It has a little bit of natural camphor flavor to it, and it is very pleasurable to drink thanks to fermentation. When fermentation is not properly controlled, or when it's uncontrolled, it can have deleterious effects, and the most common one being food spoilage. So here are two things that have spoiled. This is moldy bread, and this is garlic that has started to ferment and started to rot. Garlic's, of course, very, very healthy for you, but like anything, as it ages and goes past its prime, the molecules inside start to break down. It's defensive molecules, and now it's subject to rotting and fermentation just like anything else. Now, for oxidation, unfortunately, the strict scientific definition is kind of worthless. It's pretty hard to visualize what it means. So, oxidation is the reduction of electrons inside of a molecule or inside of an atom. That's pretty hard to wrap your head around. But the most classic and the most common example of oxidation that you can see is uncontrolled oxidation, which is when something burns or when something's on fire. Everyone's seen that. That'll give you a good idea what happens. Oxidation releases energy. If you've ever seen fire, you know it's hot. And that's things that start off cold get hot because they're releasing energy. So, what is the reaction? It's not too hard of one. Let's take a look at the most simple molecule, methane. And this molecule is a highly volatile gas. It will burn very easily. Oh, geez, my handwriting is just terrible. To yield So here's methane. plus 2O2, 2 oxygens plus a spark is going to yield CO2 and 2 waters. That's a nicely balanced equation that shows you exactly what happens. This is oxidation right there. And there's a lot of oxidation out there that happens that is not controlled. And why is that? Because oxygen is everywhere. The air itself is 21% oxygen, and it just randomly oxidizes anything it touches. So when you get, for instance, cut fruit, like bananas after a while, well, this changes the color and it changes the flavor, and that's bad oxidation. Another example would be anytime you're breathing in and you're getting oxygen in your body and it's getting on your skin or it's getting anywhere, it's oxidizing you. It's oxidizing your cells, it's oxidizing your skin, it's oxidizing your DNA, and it's not good. That's why we need to have antioxidants, just like the polyphenols inside a tea. But not all oxidation is bad. A lot of oxidation is good. So one of the things, let's take a look at that same bread before. When we put that into the toaster and we control the rate of oxidation, which is control the burning of this bread, it comes out to something that is nice and crispy and tastes really good and toasty. Another type of oxidation would be when you take white sugar, you put it in a pan and you heat it up with either water or oil, and you get caramel. Caramel is, again, controlled burning. You have to stop it before it gets to the point where it turns black, otherwise it's going to be terrible. But that's another example of very good oxidation. So what happens when you have oxidation and fermentation together? Well, here we go. This is caramel along with chocolate, oxidation and fermentation together. Let's see how this is. Well, yeah, that's just great. There's a reason I mention it, and I do it in this fashion, is because oxidation and fermentation are actually intimately connected. Both oxidation and fermentation release energy from molecules. But where does this energy come from? It actually comes from photosynthesis from plants, which gets its energy from, of course, the sun. So here's the plant that takes CO2 from the atmosphere and takes energy from sunlight, makes it into more complex organic molecules like glucose and starch and fats and all kinds of other things. And these molecules are in turn used as food sources by people or by bacteria or yeasts or animals or all kinds of other things. And the byproduct of using this energy in these molecules is CO2. So the cycle is the sun fuels the growth of plants, which feeds people and animals and bacteria and yeasts, and those oxidize and ferment those molecules and make CO2. So what is the connection that makes oxidation and fermentation a little bit kind of confusing? Is fermentation is, of course, the complex biochemical pathway that oxidizes molecules to release energy in order to sustain the life of the microorganisms. And that's the reason why it gets a little confusing, because fermentation is actually oxidation with the goal of sustaining the life of the microorganisms. So now we've got a lot of clarity on fermentation and oxidation. Question on everyone's mind is probably, all right, then let's put this to use. Which teas are fermented and which teas are oxidized? Well, actually, every tea is oxidized. There are two types of oxidation, two main types that occur in tea leaves. That is oxidation from oxygen in the air, which is called exocellular oxidation, outside of the cell. And anytime you pick a tea leaf, it starts to oxidize because the oxygen in the air will start performing its duties. The other one is when the tea grower will either wave the tea leaves, like with oolong tea, or roll them, like with pu'er tea or with black tea. And at that point, you're going to break those cells and you're going to form what is called endocellular oxidation. And that means that the enzymes from inside of the T cells are going to start oxidizing molecules from outside of the T cells, but still inside the tea leaves. And that is most prevalent in, say, for instance, Phoenix Mountain Oolong teas, when you get those wonderful flavor molecules like linalool and geraniol, and you get all those fragrances that make it such a classic tea. What about fermentation, though? So, first of all, let's take a look at a picture of fermentation, and you can see from the photo that that is a pile of tea that is being fermented, and that's not Ivy, by the way, that's her twin sister. And they're identical twins, and yes, of course, I can tell them apart. So I've got a digital temperature probe there, and it's quite warm. It was nearly 140, I think it was 143 or 145 degrees. It was pretty hot. And that is fermentation that is being induced by people in order to make those wonderful flavor byproducts that we want, that we enjoy so much in right pu'er tea. Now, of course, the yeasts that are doing that, they couldn't care less about that. All they care about is they are doing a complex biochemical pathway in order to get energy and oxidize molecules from the tea leaves to sustain their life. That's all they care about. There is one other type of fermentation that's almost not worth mentioning because it's so small. That is on every surface, every fruit, every vegetable, every tea leaf, every human, every animal. There's a tiny little bit of fermentation happening by the wild yeasts and bacteria that are growing there. So if you look at, for instance, a tea leaf, you'll see just a little tiny bit there. And that fermentation is random. It's not induced like it would be in a piled up tea that would be a right pu'er tea. And it is so small and so microscopically tiny little amount of fermentation that would occur that it is well beyond the limits of human detection to taste any flavor change or any fragrance change that would occur by those wild yeast or bacteria that are doing that. So we don't even need to worry about that at all. We don't even need to discuss it. But I just wanted to mention it though. So in conclusion, the next time that you are sitting back and having some 2004 ripe Lao Banjiang pu'er tea, think about this thing was made by yeasts that were actively fermenting some of the molecules inside those tea leaves in order to sustain their life, and thankfully they made some really tasty, flavorful byproducts that I'm enjoying right now as you take